Okay, so let's say the boss walks in, gives you this big list of data, and wants you to create a bunch of charts along with a dashboard that will be shown to the company's top client. Lucky you. Now, most people would just build a bunch of graphs, apply some nice colors, then slap them all together in a mosaic pattern, call it a dashboard, and that's pretty much the extent of it. Yet the problem is that dashboard doesn't mean anything, because in reality, you're just sharing random graphs of information that don't relate to each other, there's no logical flow, and ultimately it becomes hard for the audience to understand what's really going on with the data. Put another way, you're not telling the story of the data. Being able to tell data stories is a vital skill to have if you're a data analyst or a professional who works with large data sets. So in this video, we'll look at 2 primary ways to tell data stories. From there, dive into 7 specific data story types, then look at how to combine everything together so you can learn how to create data stories that will make your boss drool with envy. All right, let's get into it. Before we start, it's important to acknowledge that data storytelling is a very broad and deep field of study. You can literally take dedicated courses on the subject and even make a career out of it. So everything from this point forward is intended to be a guide to get you started on the path. Now, when it comes to telling the story of the data, there are 2 main ways to communicate your message, and that's using exploratory stories or explanatory stories. Each approach has its own distinct purpose, so let's break down both of them. Starting with exploratory. The exploratory storytelling method is intended to let the audience investigate the data themselves and to find out what matters most to them. Exploratory stories often rely on presenting the data in a way where the person can discover their own patterns, trends, or answers. When you use exploratory stories, the goal isn't to give a final answer, but rather to spark ideas and discussions. This approach helps to uncover key observations by letting people interact with the data directly. Some common chart types used with exploratory stories are line graphs, bar graphs, tree maps, and scatter plots. And some examples of why you would want to use an exploratory story are, let's say for instance, you want to let the sales team view their performance across a specific region, or let's say the company runs multiple marketing campaigns and you want to explore which product drives the highest conversion rate. Moving on, the next type of story is an explanatory story. Explanatory stories are all about presenting a clear narrative. The intent is to show a clear takeaway or conclusion to the audience. Simply put, the data is presented to answer predefined questions. An explanatory story has a clear structure. It starts with a beginning, goes through the middle using key points, and ends with a strong conclusion. The charts often used with explanatory stories include line graphs, bar graphs, and the often maligned pie graph and donut chart. Some examples of why you would want to use explanatory stories are, let's say for instance, you're presenting a financial report that shows the impact of a new strategy on the company's performance, or let's say it's a marketing report that explains how a particular campaign performed. All right, moving on. Now that you know the concepts of exploratory and explanatory storytelling, let's dive deeper to look at 7 different types of storytelling, each of which offers a unique way to frame and present your data. We'll list out each type one by one, and you can choose which best fits your circumstances. The first type is changes over time, and this type is used when you want to show trends or developments over time. Showing changes over time often gets people talking about why did an event happen, or what can we do to prevent it from happening again. The second type of story is drill down, and this type is intended to help people understand what is going on with a particular category. Using drill down stories often gets people asking why a particular item is performing differently. The third type is zoom out, and the intent here is to describe how something relates to the bigger picture. Or put another way, zoom out stories connect a specific topic to the overall context. Using this type of story gets people to ask how a small situation compares to a larger situation. The fourth type is contrast, and contrast stories highlight differences between 2 or more subjects. This type of story often gets people asking, why are these items different? Or how can we make A perform like B? The fifth type of story is intersections, and this type highlights important shifts when one category overtakes another. Using this type of story often gets people to discuss what caused this shift, or are these changes beneficial, and how do they affect our overall strategy? The sixth type is factors. Factors explain a particular topic by dividing it into types of categories. This story type often gets people to discuss which strategies yield the best results, Or should we invest more in high-performing areas? And the final type of story is outliers. Outliers show irregularities or where things are exceptionally different. This type of story often gets people to ask, why is this data point an outlier in the first place? And what can it teach us about our market? And that's it for the 7 story types. As you can see, they are very straightforward, none of which are too intellectually taxing. Let's move on. Now that we looked at the 2 main concepts of telling stories, then we looked at the 7 story types, let's take some time to show you some ways we can integrate and combine everything we've covered so far. So let's start off by talking about how you can incorporate the 7 story types with the exploratory concepts. Remember, exploratory stories are all about discovery. So if you choose to go with the exploratory story, you can use the 7 story types to create visualizations like this. For changes over time, you can show trends over time without any specific assumptions. For drilling down, you can look into the data to understand deeper layers without a specific goal. For zoom out, you can look at the broader sets of data to find unexpected patterns. If you choose to go with contrast, you can compare different sets of data to find interesting deviations or similarities. For intersections, you can show a point where a shift occurred that caused one category to overtake the other. If you want to demonstrate factors, you can break the data down into components to explore each one's contribution. For the outliers, they will let you identify exceptions or deviations so you can generate new questions or hypotheses. Okay, now let's talk about how you can integrate the 7 story types with the explanatory story. If you recall, the explanatory story is all about driving people to a certain conclusion or a particular point. So, for changes over time, you can show a trend over time to explain how and why a specific change occurred. For drilling down, you can offer a breakdown of the data to explain differences or changes within categories. For zooming out, you can use broad sets of data to provide background information for a specific event or a decision. A contrasting story lets you show the distinction between data to highlight specific differences and their implications. For intersections, you can demonstrate how variables are related to confirm a specific claim or theory. For factors, you can demonstrate how total elements contribute to the final outcome or total. And finally, for outliers, you can explain why the outlier exists and the overall impact it has. As you know, storytelling is a powerful way to communicate, so let's take a moment to list out some questions you can ask yourself when you start to create your stories. In no particular order, ask yourself, what point, if any, do you intend to make? What business objectives does this story relate to or support? Who is your audience? What type of emotions do you want to invoke? What are the key findings? What visualizations will help the audience understand? What are the implications of this story? How can you simplify it? Are you going to incorporate any analogies, metaphors, comparisons, euphemisms, or other fancy literary devices? What questions does the audience need answered? By methodically addressing these questions, you can craft a more compelling story because each of these questions guide the story structure and make certain that the data you present is relevant and will connect with whomever you're presenting to. Okay, so after you're done creating all your fancy charts, you're not done yet because when you build your dashboard, choosing the right layout can really make a big difference because most people don't know there is a proper way to put dashboards together. So let's take a moment to examine some patterns you can use to design your dashboard. Let's start with the F pattern. The F pattern starts in the upper left, moving right from top to bottom. The main premise is to place the most important data along the top and down the left-hand side. Next up is the Z pattern. This layout features information flowing in a Z shape with the major details in the top left and all the supporting data leading diagonally to the bottom right. Next up is the T pattern, which shows a wide section at the top for high-level insights with all the other detailed information divided below into 2 columns. Another way to design dashboards is to use a modular layout that divides the dashboard into uniform blocks or sections, with each section displaying a specific data set. And in case that's not enough, a more unconventional dashboard design is the tile card pattern that organizes each section as a distinct card, think rectangle, which contains and highlights specific numbers or data points. Not done yet. Next up is the visual hierarchy or inverted pyramid layout. This design puts the key information at the top, with increasingly detailed information below. And the final design method is the radial pattern, which features a central point with data radiating outward to show relationships or processes. Okay, so mercifully, that is it for dashboard design. One more final thought before we wrap things up. One often overlooked step is the chart titles themselves. You see, people often go with the generic, system-generated titles, yet never think to change them to make them a part of the story and make the title meaningful in some way. For example, if you have a chart labeled Sales per Category, you can change it to something more relevant like, this is how much revenue each category generated. Or if it's a line graph, you can go with something like, this is the profit trend over the past 2 years. All right, and that'll do it for this one. Please feel free to let me know your thoughts below. Don't be shy about using that like and share button. And if you want to learn more cool stuff, check out this video right here.